Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ed Ellison. I'm the Executive Director of Alumni Relations and a fellow Jumbo. I graduated in 1983. And I can proudly say that I took 3 different courses with Saul Gittleman. I've had the extra pleasure this year as Saul's been making his way around the country giving this presentation. You're going to hear most of it's still the same, right, Saul?
This one is the same as New York and D.C.
Right. Okay, so
actually, New York and D.C. was without PowerPoint.
Right. Oh. So,
you got the facility, they didn't.
Much as I would like to stick around and hear it for the 3rd time, I have a few other things to do today, but what I'd like to do is introduce the chairwoman of the Tufts Reunion Alumni Weekend Committee. Class of 84, way to go.
Hi everyone, sorry no Mike. Welcome back. Are you having a great time?
Yeah.
Great time at Pops. I think I've met all of you. You have a blast at your reunion. And it doesn't stop now. You know, Saul's talk's being recorded. So you can see him on YouTube. Go Google Saul Gittleman and see him on YouTube. It's so much fun. And think about Tufts Travel and Learn. Think about all the things you can do after reunions. Come to Tufts and Tanglewood. You got Tufts and Tanglewood people here. And a big shout out to the 82 because I'm married to an 82.
And a daughter in the dental school.
Daughter in dental school.
Anyway, so it's so fun to have you back. If you want to become involved with Tufts Alumni, talk to me. I'm happy to get more people involved. I'm a volunteer and I do a lot for Tufts and it's so much fun. So without further ado, I promise Saul, no introduction. So,
Okay, here we go. All right, let's go. We'll have, if I save enough time for Q&A or whatever, I'll be around after this is over. Something I got to just go through before I shut the lights down a little bit. This is not really a one-and-done subject. Each slide that goes up here really is a 13-week semester. It really is. You got to start digging down deep into each slide, and you will see that there is a subject here that requires a whole course. The conversation should continue. You got my email address there on the bottom. You're only a mouse click away. You know, the whole idea of Tufts alums, you should understand the nature of lifelong learning. You paid for 4, you're going to get the next 40 free. And that's what you're supposed to do. If you stop growing intellectually, you would ask for a refund. Our job was to light the Bunsen burner, get you going, and hope that it kept going for the rest of your lives. So that when they put you in the ground and they open up your rigor mortis hand, they find a registration form for some continuing education course still stuck in there. This subject, the American immigrant experience, is as American as apple pie. If I could have pressed the button, I'd have all of you turn into American history majors as a second major. Sorry, Susan became a doctor, that's fine, but I'd like her to have 2 courses in American history just to understand the nature, because we don't have much memory. We tend to think of this is the worst of all possible times. We've been through everything in this country, and we ought to understand what we've been like, and American history is something that we should study. And immigration is a template for everything in American history. Race, color, faith, conquest, manifest destiny, urban violence, as American as apple pie also. Slavery, it's American as apple pie. People who didn't immigrate here, who just came here because they were dragged over here. All of that, that's what we're all about. One thing is common to everybody. Eventually, you think about it, who was the one who came over? Very few people came to this country because they were doing terrific somewhere else. Now, we've recently come through a presidential election, and immigration was on everybody's mind. I don't care who you voted for, and who I voted for is none of your business, but we ought to understand the nature of what's going on. Let me make full disclosure first. I'm first gen. My parents were both European immigrants. My mother came here at the age of 15 or 16, without a pair of shoes. She came from someplace she thought in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, 1917, 1918. While the war was still going on, she got here. I found all her documentation in Ellis Island, so she's here. Her Aunt Bertha picked her up. Her ship manifest is here. Everything is all set. My father came from the Ukraine. She couldn't read or write. My mother never spent a day in the school in her life. She was typical, treated as a woman, a young girl back then. Nobody taught her anything. She came here, she never learned to read English or any, she read movie magazines and loved them, loved the pictures. That's what it was all about. My father came from Ukraine. He had a little religious education, but never spent a day in a normal, regular school. They never went to school in the United States, ever. And my father says he remembers coming in a big boat and getting into a little boat. He says he remembers that there were cases of Scotch whiskey on the deck of the big boat. So what does that tell us about when my father came over? He was a teenager also. Prohibition was what year? 1920. My father came over later after my mother, 21. His big boat and his little boat. My father came over as an illegal immigrant, as a kid. The immigration laws in 2021 were already starting to shut the doors. After Sacco Vanzetti, the doors started shutting. They were shut tight by 27. My father managed to get in. But illegal immigration began as soon as the word quota was first mentioned, and that was 1920. So up until then, all you had to do was have a pulse and breathe on a mirror, and you got into the United States. Remember how little Vito Corleone got in from Godfather Part 2? How did he get in? He showed up. They said, you got a disease, they quarantined him for 3 months, and then he got in. That was the 1880s, 1890s, the earliest parts of 1910. After that, it got tougher and tougher and tougher until we shut the doors completely on what we call people of color. Italians, Jews, Armenians, Greeks, anybody from the South and anybody from the East. But we'll get into that anyway. Anyhow, my parents, that's my full disclosure. They met over here at a card game. My father met my mother. She was a congenital gambler. She would bet on anything. We had degenerates in our gene pool. My mother was the good side of it. We had other relatives. I had an uncle who spent the whole family money, everything, blew it, then ran away. Changed his name to Gilbert, and he was never heard of again. So we had everything that you could hope to have in a typical American family. Okay, that's my full disclosure. I'll get to your full disclosure in a second, but let me get the lights down now so you can see better. This is a little washed out. My computer is better than your computer, and I can't see too well in any case. But here we are. Here are the 22 candidates for presidency who were running back a year or so ago. One of them came out and made it, but the others all, you could trace their ancestry. Every one came from some desperate loser. Just you go back and look at where they all came from. Impoverished Scotch, Irish, Presbyterians, whatever. So let me ask you, how many of you are not born in this country? Raise your hands. Not born. Keep those hands up. How many of you have one parent at least not born in this country? Oh, here we go. How many of you at least one grandparent not born in this country? How many hands am I going to get up? Unless I got a Penobscot, an Iroquois, or a Sioux Indian out there, unlikely, I'm going to get how many hands? Everybody. Everybody came from somewhere else. It's the unique nature of America. There was a wonderful piece that appeared yesterday in the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, and I got it and sent it to anybody who was on my mail list about intermarriage in America. Racial intermarriage. Americans eventually intermarry. We have a thing that we don't even know how we do. Somebody was asking about Islam before class, that we resent Islam. Well, we'll resent them because we resented everybody. Nobody was ever welcomed in this country. And it's just a remarkable phenomenon of who we are and where we ultimately came from. And this group of people represent. Now, coming to America, in 1620, it was be like us or else. It's always been a perilous open door in this country. And that open door started, for at least up in this part of the world. Sure, they came already to Virginia earlier, but this is where we should begin. 1620, the Pilgrims seeking religious freedom in America. What were they running from? What's another 13-week course that you should study? It's a war, European war, eponymous. It's named after the length of the war. Not 100. 30 years war. 30 years war, 1618, 1648. This year, by the way, what's going to happen on, I'm going to get you. What's going to happen on October 31st, 2017? It is the 500th anniversary, October 31st, 1517, to October 31st, 2017. Come on, there must be a Lutheran in the group. Martin Luther. And you're going to see between now and October 31st, Martin Luther everywhere. Because it's a huge year. Well, what did he do? What was it? It was the second great Christian schism, where you had Christians killing Christians, right? They hated each other. Human nature. Some things never change. So here, they came in 1620. The war had broken out in 1618. They couldn't stand it. It was butchery, slaughter, and mayhem, because after 100 years after Luther, the Europeans finally decided, let's have it out and decide what the continent's going to be, Protestant or Catholic. And it turned into a war of sheer butchery. Really slaughter. Protestant armies invading Catholic cities, cutting off all the arms and legs of the Catholic men, floating them down a river. Catholic armies invading Protestant towns, cutting off all the arms and legs of the Catholic Protestant, floating them down a river. So it was a war of slaughter with enough technology to make a difference. They're looking for religious freedom. Within 40 years, they're hanging Quakers on the Boston Common. Now, who are these Quakers they were hanging? What was their ethnicity? They were English. They came from the exact same district where the previous boatload had come from, John Winthrop's people. But they had taken Anne Hutchinson and Roger Williams, who both came from the same part. But what did they do? What was their crime? First Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson, and then Mary Dyer. They prayed a little bit differently. But they were all Protestant. They were all English. They all spoke the same language. Freud was wrong on a lot of stuff. But on one thing, Freud was right. Something that he called the narcissism of minor difference. It doesn't take a lot of difference for you to hate someone else. And the Protestants hated the Protestants. They hated each other. And they were identical DNA, if they ever knew what DNA was. Where is Mary Dyer? I mean, where do you go, besides Googling her, where is her statue? It's on the Boston Common. There it is, statue of Mary Dyer. And next to the tree, it's no longer there, but that's where they hanged her. So Protestants hating Protestants. It was quite astonishing. And they came here for what their purpose? Religious freedom. But forget it. It disappeared immediately. That hatred could come across the ocean, and it worked across the ocean. Protestants versus Protestants. The American 17th century theocracy. This was a theocracy. If you were not a Trinitarian Christian of a certain kind, you were driven out, beaten, drowned. The Baptists were being drowned on the banks of the Charles River. They burned the houses of Huguenots in Worcester. I mean, it was a violence of Protestants against Protestants, and they wanted nothing to. And the educational system was based on it exclusively. Harvard was for the Congregationalists. That's their kind of Protestant. There are 900 Protestant sects now in America. There are probably over 20 Lutheran groups in America. I mean, what do they want to do? They find a reason to separate. They find reasons to separate and find reasons to divide. Harvard was for the Congregationalists. There were some Harvard congregations that said, this is not piety. We want our own Calvinist institution. They went to New Haven and became Yale. They were drowning, as I said, Baptists on the banks of the Charles. So they went and found a town named Providence and created Brown. The Presbyterian evangelicals were sure that Christ would return to New Jersey. So they went down to New Jersey and established Princeton, College of New Jersey, right? William and Mary was for the Anglicans. There were a handful of Catholics who did come over. There were a few Catholics. Georgetown was created for that purpose, and they were also brought over by Lord Calvin, Lord Baltimore, and they had named their little piece of land after the last Catholic queen, Maryland. So Maryland, and Lord Baltimore was really a very humane, advanced kind of thinker. He said, all of you dissident Protestants who are being persecuted in New England, you're welcome down here. He invited the Protestants down. He invited the Quakers down. By 1760, it was now a Protestant majority, and the first thing they did was ban Catholicism. So some things just, they don't change, right? Human nature. The devil was alive in New England. They were hanging witches in Salem. Both Mary Dyer and the witches in Salem, some of them were executed by members of the Harvard faculty. There were Harvard faculty, Harvard students there. Some of the people who got executed were Harvard faculty and Harvard students. So it was they didn't bother with who you were. But this was what education was all about, and what Protestantism was all about too. This was the Great Protestant period, the Great Protestant surge from 1620 to 1820, and it was a struggle over faith and language. Once they got to the point where they had purged their own Protestant English thing, then they had to find other reasons to hate people, and it didn't take long. Religious conflict was language conflict. Which is the largest genetic DNA left in America? It's Germans. The Germans came, and they never stopped coming. They poured into this country. I just finished reading Benjamin Franklin's memoirs. He called them dark, swarthy, and uncivilized. He hated them. Benjamin Franklin hated the Germans. The thought that Pennsylvania, University of Pennsylvania, almost became a bilingual university. He was dead by the time they took a vote in 1791 to make German the second official language of the University of Pennsylvania, and it failed by one vote. So that it almost happened, but during his lifetime, he would have sworn. They were piling into Pennsylvania, piling into Philadelphia. Already a part of Philadelphia was called Germantown. There was a Muhlenberg. There was a Rittenhouse. The Germans were everywhere. There were more German newspapers than there were English newspapers. And the Germans were despised in this country. English, German, they were looking for naming parts of the country. The Northeast Kingdom, Bernie Sanders' territory, was up for naming. The English wanted it called Green Mountain. The Germans wanted it called Grünberg, right? The English said, we'll do whatever anybody wants as long as it's not German. So they joined with the French and called it Vermont, Green Mountain. So we got it, but as long as it wasn't Greenberg, USA, keep the German, but the Germans kept coming. You couldn't stop them. Now, it's 1750s, and we're not the United States of America yet. We're still just in 17, and we got Germans pouring in, and then something that was very pivotal for this recent election. The British made a social policy in the 1740s, 1730s, 1740s of Scotch-Irish Presbyterian farmers, tenant farmers in the Scotch-Irish lowlands. They were all Presbyterians, not Catholics. The farms all failed, and there was massive debtors, massive starvation, massive everything. What did the English decide to do with all these people? Lock them up, put them in jail, and they created a whole penal system called debtors' prisons. They locked the whole family up. It failed miserably as a social policy. The prisons were overflowing with people. They didn't know what to do with the kids. They didn't know what to do with anything. English decided around 1750, we got to get rid of these people. We'll send them to our colony. And so they loaded up ships. Many of them were people died on shipboard, but they loaded them up and sent them to America. They were totally unwanted by the 13 original colonies. They didn't want anything to do with these people, so they didn't even let them stay for overnight in the villages of the cities of the Atlantic colonies. They shipped them immediately through the city out into the mountain gaps, through the water gaps into the mountains of Appalachia, and hundreds and thousands of them settled out there. In England, they had been followers of the first Protestant king after the Glorious Revolution, William and Mary. So they were followers of King William, and they were called mockingly by the Catholic, empowered still under James II, Billy's Boys. So when they came to the United States, into Appalachia, they were finally called hillbillies. And these are people that we have always been, we say we have no classes in America, poor, impoverished white people living in the Appalachia. They spread out. They went to the Ozarks. Once we got the rest of the country going, they were shipped out and said, take, take, take. They were the ones who confronted the American Indian, the Native Americans. They were the ones who became the mountain men. The Davy Crockett's, all the mythology were based on these Scotch-Irish Presbyterians who were shipped out, who were really fodder for those people who didn't want them at all. 1790, now we are, and by the way, this group of people really voiced up in this last election. The poor white people in America voted enormously, and they voted enormously one way because they didn't like what was happening to their world. 1790 now, the first time a congressman from Connecticut got up on the floor of the Congress and said, we're all filled up. There is no more room in the United States, right? And he said, above all, we have to stop the Germans from coming in. They will not assimilate. They will never learn their English. They are hopeless. They are isolated. They don't want to talk to anybody. They are barbarians. Their language is dreadful. He held up a newspaper that was called the Mississippi Blätter that was published already in St. Louis. And he was infuriated that there also a bill had come to the floor of the Congress that that the Constitutional Declaration of Independence should be translated into German. It infuriated him, and a bill was passed. This was our first restrictive immigration law. It didn't have quotas. It just says it'll take 14 years for you to become a citizen. And that law passed. And by the way, they added a codicil at the end that said no Asiatic can ever become a citizen. So color and race were already a part of the American culture. The blacks were already here, the Indians were already in big time trouble, and now the few yellow people who came in, they didn't want them already mixing. They didn't know anything about eugenics yet, and they didn't know anything about racial science yet, but they knew this was a country whose manifest destiny was for white, male, Protestant property owners. That was who it was for. The barbarous German tongue is everywhere, he said on the floor of the Congress. But they were wrong, because Jefferson negotiated the Louisiana Purchase, 1803. We wind over doubling the size of the American land mass. What's the problem? Europe is running out of Protestants. And there is a memory of hatred that will not go away. They hate each other, but who do they hate more? How do you get all the Protestants together? Right. There was an article in the New York Times Magazine about 3 months ago about the European Union, Brexit, all of that stuff. The guy asked one Italian peasant in southern Italy, how do you feel about Brexit and how do you feel about the European Union? He said, what European Union? I hate the people in the next village. That was his quote. I hate the people in the next village. How do you get those two villages together? Show them a Roman. How do you get southern Italy together? Show them northern Italy. How do you get all of Italy together? Show them an Austrian from the Tyrol. You find that common denominator. You know, the tragic example is Yugoslavia. Tito was the first Yugoslavian. He was the last Yugoslavian. What did Yugoslavia turn out to be? Serbian Orthodox, Croatian Roman Catholic, Bosnian Muslim. And they come in there, they love each other for a minute, the two get together, they hate each other, they kill, and you get the current Balkans, which may turn to be another hotbed. Anyway, their memory of hatred, and here's a picture from C.V. Edgewood's wonderful book about the 30 Years' War, Christians Killing Christians, the 30 Years' War. This nice little small picture of a priest blessing the souls of the Protestants they just hanged. It looks innocent enough until you look at the big picture. And these were all over Europe. Hanging trees. They hang 30, 40, 50 people at a time. There's the priest going up his ladder there. That was the way the Christianity, second great schism. The first one was the one of 1054, where they excommunicated each other. But this one was much more a war of butchery. So here come the Irish Catholics. They're the only ones left over in Europe. They started coming as a little flood in 1820. By 1840, it's a tsunami. The Irish Catholics are pouring in, starving, dirty, filthy, hungry, miserable, coming over on coffin ships, because about 20% died on shipboard, threw them overboard. Then they get into the harbors at Baltimore, New York, Boston, and they left them on there for another 10 days till another 20% died, and get rid of them. And then they let them in. That was, here's a job for you, but you need not apply because you are Irish. Irish need not apply. If you look at the broadsides, the newspapers published at the time, they called them maggots, vermin, garbage, whatever. And they were not white. They were not considered white. We talk about the black Irish, but that's different. Those are the ones that were children of the Spanish and Irish merger that took place when the Armada went down. But they meant black Irish. They meant they were closer racially to black people than they were to white people. And this was what the general consensus was. These people are not civilized, they're not human, and they can never become human. This lasted right through the Civil War. A typical scene would be an Irish woman coming off a boat with 10 or 12 children, and an American mother standing there with the dock with $300 in silver in her hand, go up to the Irish mother and say, I'd like 3 of your children. Now, why? What was the nature of the war? What was the nature? It was the first American draft. But it wasn't exactly a draft. It's what we call now a selective service, which meant what? You could get yourself a replacement. Get yourself a replacement. So this American mother didn't want her children to go, and she, go to the Irish mother. Give me your 3 youngest kids; they'll be safe. So she'll take the 8, 9, and 10-year-old boy, put him in the army. What are they going to do in the army if you're 8, 9, and 10? Your drummers, your fifers, your play. They were dead before the Battle of Gettysburg was over. So they were dead. I mean, when they went from boat to battlefield, and nobody even knew it. And when the casualty lists were posted in New York City after the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863, the Irish mothers went crazy, and there was massive revolt and violence in New York City. Urban violence, driven by the Irish. And who did they lynch and who did they hang? If they could find Chinese laundrymen, if they could find blacks, they burned the black orphanage. It was poor people battling poor people, and that's what happened. The Irish lived through that until the 1880s when they earned their whiteness, and they became sufficiently white. There was also intermarriage. This article I was referring to in the Times, Globe, Boston Globe, Washington Post, and Wall Street Journal was the latest Pew statistic on intermarriage. And we don't even know how it happens. But this country relentlessly intermarries. Once we ended the miscegenation laws, and that was when? 1967, Loving versus Virginia, and that said blacks and white couldn't be married. Up until then, 41 states had laws that say you cannot marry a white, cannot marry a black, you cannot marry a Filipino, you cannot marry an Asian, you cannot marry anything. So we had this thing institutionalized, but once it ended, it was assimilation like a racehorse. And the Irish also were doing it because there were no laws that they were considered black, but they could earn their whiteness, and it managed. But if you weren't white, you were invisible in this country at that time. If you were black, you had slavery. What did the Dred Scott decision say in 1857? It said what the Constitution said. No, it said a black person is worth how much? 3/5 of a white person. That's the way it is. That was the way they counted the votes. So the Supreme Court has always been in your face. It's always been active. So this is not new now either. Everybody's worried about what Supreme Court never did. It's always been this way. Emancipation, yes, but then Reconstruction failed from 1865 to 1877. Then came the Jim Crow, separate but equal, was never equal. Plessy Ferguson versus Ferguson, 1896, institutionalized it, and it stayed that way until the last 50 years, actually. So for the black person, never was that. If you were yellow, they were brought over by the thousands to build the Great Western Railroads. And then by that time, who were the supervisors? The Irish. I just watched Cecil B. DeMille's Union Pacific, 1939. Everybody had an Irish accent. Barbara Stanwyck had an Irish accent. By the way, I retired when I couldn't find an undergraduate who ever heard of Barbara Stanwyck. So that was the end for me. But she had an Irish accent in the Cecil B. DeMille thing. You didn't see one yellow face in the whole movie. It was astonishing. Those that survived that terrible life out there crawled on their hands and knees and established the Chinatowns of the Western Syria. As soon as they were done building the railroads, the Chinese Exclusionary Act was passed, and they were banned from immigration to the United States. If you were red, it was disease, feudal wars, the Trail of Tears. Andrew Jackson, who said, you're out of here, out of Alabama and Georgia, sent them on the Trail of Tears to Oklahoma. Then we got them out in Oklahoma, and we killed them out in Oklahoma. And the reservation. So if you were red, you were in big time trouble. If you were brown, they didn't get into the mix until the War of 1846, when we grabbed the biggest of our great land grabs was from California and Texas. We took a third of Mexico, and we wound up with all these brown people, made them citizens, but second-class citizens. And that became the nature of Manifest Destiny. So if you were Irish Catholic, you were not white until you could earn your whiteness. The same as the Germans. They eventually managed, by intermarriage or whatever, they could become white. You could change your name, you could change your nose, you could change your religion, give up your religion. You could make it in America if you were something that you didn't want to be. What was the meaning of Manifest Destiny? From Lewis and Clark to the Spanish-American War, from sea to shining sea. What's one of the great lines from that song? From sea to shining sea, God shed his light on thee. This country was settled by people of faith, and they still are extraordinarily important in the national mix. We are a nation of faith. Over half the American people still believe the creation story. There are more people that attend the Creation Museum in Petersburg, Kentucky, that go to the MFA every year. I mean, it's a nation of faith, and it's always going to be a nation of faith. Even with immigrants coming in now, they will produce the same impact. But Manifest Destiny meant this country was selected by whom to be what we were. It was God's will. And how it happened, the making of America. We're a little bit washed out here. My computer looks better. But if you look at how the America got the way it was, Treaty of Paris, this is what Britain gave up after we beat them. They had treaties with all these Indians, but we sent the mountain folks out here to take all of this. That became Jeremiah Johnson and the rest of it. Then came the Louisiana Purchase. Then came the Texas annexation, the Mexican annexation, and we finally made it from sea to shining sea. Our geography, if there is a God's blessing on America, it's our geography. Two massive oceans and rivers that all run diagonally. You can, once they built the Erie Canal, you could go from the Hudson to the Columbia. And that doesn't happen in a lot of countries. So Hawaii, we grabbed, after we got here, we finished it up. It was the end of the frontier. We just kept going. We got Hawaii and the Philippines. We took all of that too. That was President McKinley praying on his knees, said, God told me we should take the Philippines. And that's what we did. We went and took the Philippines. This was the vision. This is unfortunately not too much contrast, but there she is in the middle. This was the most popular lithograph in 19th century America. There she is, Columbia, big, blonde, buxom, with a book under her arm, so that's the Bible, with a telegraph cord in her hand, holding on. Here's one railroad, here's another railroad, here are the farmers, here are the miners, here are the Conestoga, here's the Conestoga wagons, but simply, what's getting driven this way? The buffalo, the Indians, the animals, here we go. Now, it's our relentless move from one ocean to the other, and this was the vision of a nation triumphant. Here's the promontory point, Utah, May 10th, 1869. Again, the unification of the railroad. Every face that you see here is white, every one. So this was the image that we were going to have. They reenacted it in 1969 at the Centennial, and they put 3 black faces in, here, here, and here, but still not a yellow face anywhere. Now, the last massive immigrant wave of the 19th century, 1880 to 1920, 2 more non-white people. But by this time, science was coming into the picture. There was a new way that you could define science. After Darwin, science started taking a look at this and said, yes, there are racial differences, and a new field emerged that was called eugenics. And you could see who was white, who was not white, who was Caucasian, who was not, and the academic communities really loved it. And so political scientists and anthropologists, a new field at Harvard, Hopkins, Chicago, MIT, not Tufts. I went to the Tufts archives and I found 2 references to eugenics in the whole medical school and arts and sciences archive. We were not into eugenics. One of the references was from a professor in the medical school who said this eugenics is a lot of hooey. So we even had the one guy who said it's a lot of whoop. 2 more non-white people, the Jews and the Italians. Now, there were Jews in America already. There were 100,000 German Jews. Did they welcome the masses from Eastern Europe?
No.
Forget about it. They hated it. What? There were already millions of Catholics in America when the Italians came. Did the Irish Catholics welcome the Italian Catholics? Forget about it. I had a kid in class, Elizabeth Kenny, about 5 or 6 years ago, and I told the story. She said, now I know why my grandmother wouldn't even let a can of SpaghettiOs into the house. She said, bring home anybody, but don't bring home an Italian. So, I mean, the hatred of these co-religionists, in a way, was remarkable. The East European Jews, when they saw the German Jews, when they saw the East European Hasidic Jews, they almost got sick. They didn't want them. They tried to keep them out, send them back, do anything they could. But it was time. In Tsarist Russia, 1881, it was for the East European Jews time to get out. They knew that they were finished in the little Jewish communities in Tsarist Russia, the shtetls. They were killing kids, killing pogroms were everywhere. The Jews had nowhere to go. They knew that Russia was the end of them, so it was enough of the shtetl preparing to leave. And we tend to romanticize these places. This is not a bunch of guys dancing with bottles on their head. This was filth, dirt, disease, garbage, just a horrible, horrible way of life. But it was time to get out. Leaving the Pale, the only way you could get out of the Pale of Settlement in Russia was to walk out. You walked to Bremerhaven, you walked to Antwerp, you walked as far as you possibly could to get out. Same thing happened in southern Italy. The fields failed, the farms failed, they had starvation and massive disruption, they had to get out. So you could sail from Naples, a steerage class, to America. It was $15 in 1890. When the Titanic went down, most of the people who drowned, who died, were living where? Steerage. The Germans call it Zwischendeck, literally between the decks. This is pretty generous because they could stand up. Many times you could barely stand up if you lived. You brought your own food, you didn't get any food, you had to take care of yourself, and it was a tough way to come over to America, but it was better than any other way. And here they came. The Italians and the Jews were pouring in. Sometimes they let the Italian women come up on deck from steerage. Here's a picture in 18. We also had lucky to have two great photographers, Louis Hines and what was his name, Reese. I'll get his name in just a minute. Who were taking photographs at this time. Here's a typical scene on top of the ship. They loaded them up. For $15 a head, they put as many heads in as they possibly could. In 1892, the numbers got so huge, the federal government had to establish a new landing station in New York City. There was an upcrop of land named Ellis Island, and they built on that. Here comes Emma Lazarus. She says, what? Give us your poor. That's not exactly the way it was. They came and they managed because back home, things were worse. So they came here. Ellis Island was opened in 1892. Arriving in Ellis Island from 1880 to 1920, it was a mob scene coming in regularly. They didn't know any English, they didn't know anything, but they still let the doors open. An Italian father arriving without, a family arriving without a father. Some, there were predatory people waiting for them. Send these women into prostitution. Send the children into prostitution. It was a tough existence. The Jews and the Italians had only each other, and they were driven together. So they were driven together, cheek to jowl, in neighborhoods that they call Little Israel and Little Italy. They were together. It was filth, horses blowing up in the summertime, guts all over the place, a horrible, filthy, dirty life. You can go to the Tenement Museum in New York City, looks pretty good, but that not exactly the way it was. Abandoned Jewish children, there were Jewish orphanages everywhere. Jewish women were abandoning their children. The husband would come over, said, I'll come over, I'll send for you. Got over here, met Shirley Shiksa, said, that's it, I'm through. Dumped the wife or forgot the wife, ran away. The woman is left with little children. She comes over to America, can't find the husband. There's no help. This is not a safety net here. And what she did was abandon the children. They were abandoned, they were orphanages. Jewish prostitution flourished all over Allen Street. The Italian neighborhood had its own prostitution. Allen Street closed down on Friday night, opened again on Saturday night. There were Italian husbands without wives, 5-cent lodging, men pushed together. A closet homosexual community exploded. Jacob Riis called it the foul core of New York slums. This is what tenement life really looked like around 1900. Here's what the newspapers were writing. You didn't have much to read. Could these people become white? This is from the Tribune, 1898. The neighborhood where these people live is absolutely impassable. They claim to have been driven out of Poland and Russia. The neighborhood is the eyesore of New York City, perhaps the filthiest place on the Western continent. A Christian could not live there because he will be driven out by the stench and the dirt. Cleanliness is an unknown quantity to these people. They cannot be lifted up to a higher plane because they do not want to be. That's genetically. Eugenically, they do not want to be lifted. This is where they belong. They're garbage, they're vermin. The article was written by a second-generation Irish kid who had no idea that his own grandparents, or his parents were described the same way 50 or 60 years earlier. As far as the Italians were concerned, this is earlier, 1875. They are extremely ignorant, have been reared in the belief that brigandage is a manly occupation, that assassination is the natural sequence of the most trivial quarrel. They are miserably poor, and it is not strange that they resort to theft and robbery. It is perhaps hopeless to think of civilizing them. Never. No chance. Now, they also brought down unwanted ideas. They were labor organizers, freedom for women. It was a tough time. It was before 1920, women didn't have the vote. Here you got these big-mouthed women who come over here, Rosa Luxemburg, Emma Goldman, Golda Meir. They come over. They abandoned from the Yiddish course, you remember? They abandoned their Orthodox Jewish fathers, say, stuff it, Pop, it's over. Come over here and become anarchists and bomb throwers and worse. But here she wants a union. Immigrants organizing against child labor in Yiddish and in English. Violence. The Los Angeles Times building blown up in 1910 by 2 Irish, and they were called terrorists. 20 people were dead. They blew up the New York Times because it's something about the Irish. New York Stock Exchange blown up by Italian terrorists. 2 weeks after Sacco Vanzetti were arrested, the stock exchange was blown up. 30 people were killed. So violence, urban violence in the face of immigrants, we've had it. We've done it before. Even I can barely read this, but I'm going to do it. Immigration Restriction League was inevitable, the pushback. The Immigration Restriction League, founded in 1894 at Harvard, the triumph of academic eugenics, the vocabulary of testing. Here is their objectives. The objective of the League shall be to advocate and work for the further judicious restriction or restriction regulation of immigrants, to the documents and circulars, solicit facts and information on the subject, hold public meetings, and to arouse public opinion to the necessity of a further exclusion of elements undesirable for citizenship or injurious to the national character. We had 2 presidents who made public statements, speeches, about what they call racial suicide, Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. They were both men who understood the nature of eugenics and were committed to it. The irony is, and here, they talked about, they only read Yiddish newspapers in America. Well, there were 12 Yiddish newspapers in New York City in 1900. Within 50 years, nearly all of them were gone. What happens? What do we do in this country that we never understand? We don't even know how we do it, but it happens. There is assimilation within 2 generations, and it's gone. Here's a lady, a book in English, because nobody could read the original Yiddish. Dear editor, I have 4 little children. My husband has abandoned me. I speak no English. I'm all alone in this country. Help me, please. She didn't know who to write to, so she wrote to the editor of the Yiddish newspaper, the Vorwärts. And this began letters to the editor. This was the end of the 19th century. So it starts that way because they couldn't, but we can't read this in Yiddish, so we have to read it in English because you don't know any Yiddish anymore. Selling Yiddish in Italian newspapers in 1905, they thought this was the biggest, there were more people reading Yiddish and Italian newspapers in New York City in 1905 than were reading English newspapers. But these people consider themselves patriots. They love this country. But already they're writing songs, Leben soll America, long live America. But they have to write it now in the Roman letters as well as the Yiddish. The icons are George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, the Statue of Liberty. They love it. This is their country. In the meantime, they are hated. But they're not going to give up. Now, how do you get out of the ghetto? You can fight your way and play ball as your way. You can do lots of things. How did the Irish get out? The Irish and the Germans. I mean, you look at baseball, you look at prize fighting, John L. Sullivan, Gentleman Jim Corbett, Jim Fitzsimmons, baseball players, John McGraw, Connie Mack, the Irish and the Germans dominate. Lou Gehrig's parents couldn't even speak English. Honus Wagner himself barely spoke English. So German and the Irish found their way. They were able to get out. By 1884, they had mayors already, school teachers, but it started with prize fighters. And here's Benny Leonard, Benjamin Leiner. Between 1900 and 1930, there were 28 Jewish prize-fighting champions and 15 Italian prize-fighting champions. They got it in boxing. So prize-fighting was one of their ways out. Barney Ross, whose real name was Berdov Rozovsky, lightweight champion, born 1909. This is the first generation born in America. These are first gens. Tony Canzonieri, born 1908, won 3 titles. They're all little guys. They're not big. The Jews and the Italians dominated basketball. Hank Lucetti. But they were too short, so they had to invent a new way. They couldn't get over the tall Gentile players. The jump shot. They invented the jump shot to get up, jump in the air, throw it up. The white guys never left their feet. They couldn't figure out what was happening here. But they were dominant. They became the best basketball players in America in the 1920s and 1930s. By 1930, they make it in baseball. Hank Greenberg, Detroit Tigers, born 1911 in America, parents both European, baseball career 32 to 47. Gene is DiMaggio on the cover of Time, born 1914, parents both immigrants, baseball. So they're assimilating, they're making it, they're coming in, they're getting it. The other way you can make, here are their mugshots. The other way you could get it, you could shoot your way out of the ghetto too. And the Jews and the Italians shot their way out. Who got in the way? The Irish. They were the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, Mugs of Moran, or the Morans, and they were gone. The Jews and the Italians got together and had it their way for a while. The legacy of little is Meyer Lansky. He was born in Nepal, came over as a little baby. So he's born 1902, but this is the generation. Charlie Luciano was born in Sicily, 1897, but he came over as a little baby also. They dated each other's sisters, they married each other's family, the Jews and the Italians. Who came out on top? Who organized crime? The Italians. Who did all the killing? The Jews. The Jews were they considered them the most sociopath. Bugsy Siegel was a sociopath, and they said, Murder Incorporated was about 95% Jewish, and they did all. There was Orthodox Jewish killers like Red Levine in St. Louis, who never killed on Friday night to Saturday night. They killed you the rest of the time. So they're all. And this is not me. This is documented academic history of American immigration. This is where things started really going bad. The closing of the doors. Sacco Vanzetti, two Italian anarchists, 1920, the Braintree, Massachusetts robbery, two people killed, and between 1920 and 1927, when they were executed, all the restrictive immigration laws were done. They were closed. That was it. Illegal immigration began then. Book just came out this year, Illegal Jewish Immigration. The immigration started immediately. There's so much money to be made in human trafficking even then. Right now it's enormous. But back then, there was also money to be made in illegal immigration, and it started immediately. The Jews poured in through Mexico, poured in through Cuba, Italians jumped off ships. There's an organization in New Jersey called the Boat Jumpers Association, all Italian. First, second, third Italian generation, and their logo is two guys jumping out of a rowboat in front of the Statue of Liberty. Here, this is a book that came out this year, Imbeciles by Adam Cohen. It's called The Supreme Court, American Eugenics, the Sterilization of Carrie Buck. This was the writing of the restrictive immigration law. How do we close off immigration between the 20s and 27? The testing. It was done primarily by testing. Professor Goddard administered the B'nai Simons to newly arrived immigrants on Ellis Island in 1913 and got startling results. He found that 79% of Italians, 80% of Hungarians, 83% of Jews, and 87% of Russians were feeble-minded. After reworking the results, he came up with the figures that still defied belief. He reported that between 40 and 50% of these groups were feeble-minded, with a mental age of less than 12. That testimony was made in front of Congress, and it became the law of the land. Nice book, interesting book. This 8-to-1 decision, by the way, also played out with poor white Americans, because this 8-to-1 decision was the decision in the Supreme Court in the case of Buck versus Bell. I don't know if you ever know the case of Carrie Buck, who is a poor Scotch-Irish Presbyterian girl. She was 15 or 16 or 17, who already had 3 illegitimate children. And they said, this was the case written by Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was Supreme Court Justice at the time, the Chief Justice. And his famous last line of this case was, lawyers, historians, 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. And Louis Brandeis signed off. He was one of the 8. And they thought, this is it. We got too many stupid people in America. Turns out she was raped by an uncle. Her IQ, they did a lot of more testing later on. She was perfectly intelligent, perfectly everything. But she got sterilized along with 70,000 other Americans, thanks to the Supreme Court. So, we've been through it. Now, what we didn't realize, and this is the good part of it, you close the doors. The doors are shut. We got a bunch of kids born in America. Their parents were all immigrants. They were born in this country 1890, 1900, 1910. They wanted better. What do? In New York City, if we use it as an icon? They had compulsory education. You had to learn English. You forgot maybe second generation. You might have been bilingual. But even today, with the Latino population, first of all, the most popular name among second-generation born Latinos in the United States are Kevin and Ashley. They just want to be Irish. And as I said, intermarriage is exploding. It's just going on. And as long as there are no laws to stop it, it will happen. So you got a bridge built in 1883, the Brooklyn Bridge. Walk across it. You got a 1905, the Manhattan Bridge. Walk across it. Where are they walking to? Brooklyn? The Queens? They could go north to the Bronx. Queensboro Bridge, 59th Street, 1909. Queens then and now. Now Queens is, again, a terrific ethnic neighborhood. A Ridgewood section of it's remarkable. Now, after the doors closed, from the ghetto to suburbia, the path to assimilation, they're walking. They're walking and they're going to schools in the cities. Why? Because the elite schools in America did what? In sort of parallel to the immigration law, we also shut the doors. We were saying President Abbott Lowell of Harvard, 1922, said, we have too many Italians, too many Jews here. Who agreed? The Irish and the Germans. You're right. Let's limit it. In fact, Columbia went so far as to put a German Jew on every admissions committee so they could pick out the East European Jews who were trying to fake it. There was a 9-page admissions letter. It's a wonderful book by a guy named Jerome Carabelli, University of California, wrote an 800-page book on admissions in the 1920s to 1960s. It's a dynamite book. He got all the data out. He dug it all out. And so Harvard closed the doors in 1922. A month later, Yale closed the doors. 3 months later, Tufts closed the doors. We had quotas. That was it. We went along with everybody else, and we did what we were supposed to do. In the meantime, they're coming out onto Long Island, and the Protestants are saying, someday there's going to be one last Protestant hanging on to Montauk Point by his fingernails, because everybody's pushing out. So, as long as it's a democracy, they'll go and they'll find a way. Here's the democracy from 1920 and 1950. The door is shut. You see the dip. The door is shut. We had college quotas. We also we had no Nobel Prizes in the 20s. When was the Nobel Prize award started? 1901. From 1901 to 1933, it's a wholly German-owned subsidiary. The Germans dominated it, 80%. The Germans won everything. The great gift for a barbarian that he was, murdering 50,000 people, responsible for it, the gift to America was Adolf Hitler, who ruined in one generation the German universities, then destroyed the European universities. Our doors were closed. Our faculty didn't want Europeans on it. They didn't want it. When the German Jews were shut out of Germany in 1933, they were all looking for jobs. We let 3 in, Einstein, Szilard, and Fermi. We got the bomb, won the war, opened the door a little bit further, and by the time the GIs were coming back, the quotas were going. They couldn't put up with it anymore. Nils Wessel ended them. Actually, Carmichael started, then Wessel ended them, and it was over after that. And then we started getting our own share of the Nobel Prize. By that time, the European system was in ruins, and American higher education started its great 30-year growth. We took the immigrant scientists, America's golden age of higher education, door open. So now the immigration thing is coming up, and we got various other things. So here we are. But the debate goes on. Where are we today as a nation of immigrants? Who wants to come? Not the Europeans. Everybody else. And everybody else are people of color. They want to come from Asia. They want to come from Latin America, from Africa, anywhere. The Europeans are happy with their safety net. And these people are just as desperate as your ancestors were when they sold their children and came. They'll do the same thing. The result today with technology, however, is an explosion of pornography, child prostitution, you name it. You got 3 kids, you'll sell 3 into slavery or prostitution to keep 6 or 7 free and get them to this country. If you're desperate enough to swim across shark-infested Caribbean or send your kids in containers from Asia, you'll do anything to get your family safe. So who wants to come? Desperate. Look at those people who come across the Mediterranean. I mean, they're dying, drowning, but they're going to keep coming. What's different? The race issue once again. It's just the race issue again in America, and yet the biggest business of all is human trafficking. It's bigger than drugs, although it's combining with drugs, bigger than arms, because this is about, you just cannot imagine the amount of money And then there's the idea that we can stop it. Senator McCain said it when he ran for the presidency. He said it then, show me a 50-foot fence, and I'll show you a 51-foot ladder. We think we can stop it. We have numbers that say the numbers are way down. There was an article the other day in the Wall Street Journal that said, thank you very much for making the idea of the fence. That was a remark made by a drug dealer and an importer of people from Mexico. Push it back. We'll just start them longer and make more money. So how you do it, I don't know. It's never succeeded in this country because this is the place they want to be. By the way, when we started, we closed the doors in 1920. There were 40 bridges across the Rio Grande that the Mexicans could walk free of charge. So the Mexicans were coming in with cheap labor, we needed it then, and it was an easy thing for them to do. Some things never change. Was this a white rebellion in this most recent election? It's something that's part of America. It's part of the American fabric to understand why all these people didn't want a woman, and they were kind of playing off 2 terms of a black president. And there were a lot of things at play, but some of it was American history for the last 400 years. You know, be like us or else. The presidential candidates, some of them were from South Asia, some of them were from any place in the world. But somehow we get here and we say, you have to be like us or we don't want you. Some things just never change. Thank you. Okay. All right. No, I'm good. Are there any? All right, now you can argue, debate. I have no particular axe to grind, but if I let my old prejudice, if I have a prejudice, I just say this is the way it is. We are a nation of immigrants. We can't stop it, and it won't stop because this country is what they want. So, all right, argue, question, or hands. Anything? Yes.
Saul, have you ever given this lecture to a flipped audience, one that isn't predominantly white, upper educated, and what do you think your response
I only go where I'm told to go, and that's Tufts. You know, we are what we are.
What the response might be if you went to a different...
You know, I don't know. I've given it to a very wealthy country club in Florida, and they were really wild about it. They made it too. You know, yes.
So just given all of this and your perspective, is there a future for real comprehensive immigration reform in the United States?
We never had it. I mean, you know, we never have. We've had a country that's had one civil war. We've had other times when fellow senators beat each other up on the floor of the Senate with canes. We have had every conceivable kind of nut farm. I mean, democracy is really a mess. Everybody despaired. Churchill despaired. Everybody despaired. But when you look at the other systems, what else have we got? But we really weren't a liberal democracy until 50 years ago. Until the Voter Registration Acts of the 1960s, there were too many people that were completely excluded. We let them in after that, and then since then, we had a lot of unhappy people. They don't want them voting. They don't like them around. That's America. You know, I'm not saying, I don't like to call people racists, but race is important in this country, and it always will be. It always has been. So how are you going to change human nature? We've only got 6,000 years of human history. That's all we have. The whole history of humanity is documented in 6,000 years of documents. You know, it all depends. If you're a person of faith, then you believe the creation story. If you're not, if you're an atheist, then you say we're nothing but a naked ape. But both scenarios end up in apocalypse. The people of faith believe that when the Messiah comes, if the Messiah comes today, there's no reunions tomorrow. Right? That's over. It's God's time. On the other hand, if somebody presses the right button in 5 or 10 or 15 years and blows the world up, that's conceivable because the world was once destroyed by flood. That took a miracle. The next time it's destroyed by fire, it won't take a miracle. We have the capacity ourselves. And you got guys like E.O. Wilson who are out there saying, don't worry, the Anthropocene age is over. The age of man is over. Now it's the ants, the bees, the wasps, the termites that will take over. And who's to say he's wrong? I don't know. Yes, yeah, please.
Can we go the other way and we fix the world?
Can Homo sapien fix the world?
Well, the United States.
The United States fix the world. I don't know. 6,000 years is not about China. We've had 400-year history of this country. I don't know. We are the only country right now, although Australia may be getting close, that is really, in many ways, the world's garbage can. We took everybody who wanted to come here and gave them a chance, and survival of the fittest, the great ones rose and created this remarkable country. Of course, we did a lot of it with slavery, but we did it. It happened, and we got rid of that. And here we are looking for legislation, looking for us to fix it ourselves. I don't know. I've become atavistic. I'm in my 9th decade. So all I care about now is my senior community and my children and grandchildren. I don't know. I don't know what our capacity is as a nation or as a people. I know that we have been triumphalist for too long. We think that everything we do is wonderful, and it isn't. Yeah. Hold it. I got about another gender. Hold it. There was a lady. Right. Hold on. 1 and 2. Go ahead.
Do you think a couple hundred years of increased immigration will help integration?
Oh, that's the big horse race. That's the big horse race. As this country, we don't know how we give people enough freedom, they'll find each other. Love conquers all. I mean, it's amazing the amount of intermarriage: black, white, yellow, white, red Indian, Native American males. Something like 60% of them are marrying another race. So it's happening all over the place. So it's kind of wild. Yeah.
Is man too tribal to be fixed?
That's the anthropologists or the sociobiologists. The sociobiologists say there are about 6 or 7 or 8 species that have this capacity to cooperate socially and then keep themselves going while they're killing somebody else. So tribalism, yeah. Are we a chimp? Are we a bonomo? What are we? But that's not the faith-based position. I don't know. But that's an argument. Are we too tribal or we're not tribal enough? Yeah.
Do you find that today's super internet communication age, is that more of a help?
The only thing that changes is technology. Nothing, in 6,000 years, we have not, you don't change I don't think you change the wiring. I don't think you can have evolution that much. You can have little habits. The kids walk around with this thing frozen to their ear, and they talk to their parents 4 times a day. We used to negotiate when we're going to call, reverse the charges, all that. So you did whatever you could. That changed. But it's technology. It has some effect, but it's not changing human nature. Just changing technology. I arrived here with 30 sheets of carbon paper and a Smith Corona portable typewriter. I mean, you imagine what I've had to go through in 50 years? I mastered 10% of the internet. It's enough to keep me going for the rest of my life. That's enough. Huh? Whoa, boy. Okay, question. Yes, back there.
Yeah, that is the perfect question. What I wanted to ask was, if you think the impact of technology and what's happening used in other countries is having an impact here. For example, I heard a really interesting interview with NPR recently where someone in France was talking about the practice of religion in France and said, oh, well, based on our history, we do that behind closed doors, and therefore that's why we don't allow the job and all that stuff in the street, because we don't want to see the street. What you do in your synagogue, your mosque, or behind your closed doors is fine, but we don't want to see publicly on the street because of technology and this, the way we sit smaller as a globe. Is that influencing perhaps what's happening?
America, and I'll make the point again, when de Tocqueville described America in that wonderful book, Democracy in America, and he described us as exceptionnel, we translated it as better. We certainly are different. There's a very good book by a guy named Seymour Martin Lipset called American Exceptionalism, a Two-Edged Sword. And that's what it is. We are different from any developed nation in the world. Maybe South Korea is the only other developed nation that's a nation of faith. You go to the European churches, they're not empty, they're vacant. Europeans, they've walked away from it as they do. We are a nation of faith. We got 60, 70, 80 million evangelicals. We don't even know how many. And if you don't understand Branson, Missouri, and Tulsa, Oklahoma, you don't get it. They had the French Revolution, we had the American Revolution. Sure, we had Thomas Jefferson and the Jefferson Bible. I don't know if you know the Jefferson Bible, it's in the Smithsonian. He carved out every miracle that Jesus did and carved it out of his Bible. So the Bible that you have in the Smithsonian is the Bible. He thought Jesus was wonderful, but he didn't think he was divine. He was a universalist. And so that was Jefferson, but that was not America. In America, we had great awakenings, and we have faith. We are also missionary-driven. We're out there. We're waiting for the world to become Christian. The state of Israel was built in many ways by Christian Zionists who said, when the Jews go back to Palestine and go back to Israel, Christ will return. When Herzl, who founded Zionism, went to Palestine and saw somebody praying at the Wailing Wall, his diaries say he threw up. He had, what is this? He wanted a German-speaking secular country. And he got Israel. But he died in 1904, so man plans and God laughs. Yes?
A lot of the story about the United States is associated with the rise of immigrants from low status to higher status and that sort of thing.
And the ones who didn't make it disappeared along the way. Not very easy to make it in America.
But the theory is the longer you're here, your descendants tend to rise socially. You have this new phenomenon that's often discussed about the disintegration of this old working white collar population. Do you think this is unique? Do you see other examples?
In this country?
Yes.
Well, the largest recidivism in this country, let me talk to your first point. The Italians, Poles, and Greeks were the largest number who ever returned. About 20% of all Italians went back to Italy. They didn't like it. And the Greeks and the Poles now, they take their social security and go back to Poland, they go back to Greece. That's their country. That's the way they really want to make it. As far as poor whites are concerned, that's also as American as apple pie. They've been poor then and they're poor now. They've been poor for 250, 300 years.
So you don't see any change in that?
Some get out, some make it. I read J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegies. Some people can make it and some can't. This is a social Darwinist country in many ways. It's survival of the fittest. If you've got hunger and you're tough and you can make it, you'll make it in America. It is a selectivity. You can do it. You can shoot your way out. You can play basketball your way out. You can become a genius your way out, whatever. But the ones that fall through the safety net are legion, an endless number. It's only success stories that we like to talk about. Okay, yes and yes. Let me go, lady first.
So you've always given.
Oh, it's Nancy, okay.
You've always given the list of great books to read. Can you recommend to us today what you would say are 3 great books?
Well, I wouldn't call them great, I'd call them relevant. And the relevant books today are this J.D. Vance book called Hillbilly Elegy, which is the story of a poor white guy whose family was abusive, wretched, miserable, hokey, and he broke out, and he made it. But the family itself was a horrible, horrible story. And the other one is called White Trash. It's the history of what we've done to this group of people who were, Beverly Hillbillies, Hee-Haw, Green Acres. We made fun of them in the media and laughed at Jed Clampett and Belleville. Good times. These were the poor white people who were out in the middle of the Appalachians and the Ozarks, Bill Clinton's family, struggling. Then every once in a while, Bill Clinton, boom, he comes out, and one of them makes it. And then you get the ones that make it are remarkable. And the ones that went down and disappeared, forget it. The Hatfields and the McCoys killing each other. But we made, those are people that have always been part of American culture. So, they make it, some will make it, and some won't. And there's always fights in this country. It's always contentious, always argumentative. We just don't remember. We think of it's like universities. We say it was a great time. We used to have wonderful K through 12. We never had great K through. Half the K through 12 are wonderful, and half are dreadful. That's always been that way. We'll never do it because it's taxes. We got 15,000 school districts. We used to have 150,000 school districts, and you can't get Medford and Malden to agree on the same history book. So nothing changes.
Is the relationship between race and immigration in this country, where you can come as an immigrant and your family might be only a couple of 100 years old, whereas the family of maybe your black neighbor is 400 years old, but that family came by a slavery.
It doesn't make any difference, I think. There was a great Star Wars episode, or Star Trek episode, Frank Gorshaw played it. There was two guys, one with, this side of the face was white, this side of the face was black. The other guy, this side of the face was black, this side of the face was white. And they still hated each other. You know, what I think is, I haven't quite figured out and understood yet, is the nature and capacity of human nature to hate. People who are different.
Human conditions, not about.
You know, I don't know. I'm only giving you something to go home and argue about on the trip back. Yeah, I think last question, I'll stick around, yeah. Hey, which gentleman in the corner? Oh, I'm sorry, excuse me.
Oh, thank you. This was just great, just great.
Thank you.
Not to mention that the Germans had the formula for beer. We had to let them in.
We let the Germans, they were okay, but when World War I broke out, Germans got lynched on the streets of New York City, Boston. The hatred to the Germans right through World War I, then it wiped it out of the public school system. German was the biggest language going in the American school system till World War I, then it wiped it out. And Prohibition was the revenge of all those ladies on the Germans. Okay, let's crack it up. Oh. Woo. Put it away. You don't have to give me